All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this much awaited space news webinar. We've got a lot of you on the call, a lot of interest in this one. This is Trump 2.0, how the space sector is expected to change. We've got really a great lineup here today. I'm just going to rattle through them really quickly, and then we're going to get to a bit of housekeeping, kind of show you how this is going to be shaping up, and then we'll get into it. First off is Lori Garver, who's former NASA deputy administrator and the author of a really just excellent book, Escaping Gravity. So I see everybody sort of nodding their heads on here in agreement here. It made some waves when it came out, but it's still very much relevant today. Michelle Hanlon, who's the executive director of the Center for Air and Space Law at the University of Mississippi. Michelle's going to help us sort of lay the groundwork for what promises to be sort of this interesting progression in the legal frameworks governing space. And it's Courtney Stead, who's executive vice president of the Beyond Earth Institute. And Courtney has played sort of instrumental roles in these leadership transitions in the past, and he provides kind of a unique voice. We're going to get to a bit of housekeeping first. The way this is going to work is we'll do about 45 minutes worth of discussion. It will go by pretty quickly, and then about 15 minutes worth of Q&A at the end. So put your questions as we go into this. I'm going to try to get to as many as possible, but it sort of makes this a little bit more of an interactive experience, gets everybody involved. I also wanted to mention that Space News is launching a new podcast, Space Minds, later this month, which is endeavors to sort of bring together the minds of leading space founders and CEOs and scientists and engineers, and not really only just from this country, but really from around the world. At one point in cases, our inaugural guest is Rocket Lab's founder, Peter Beck. So that will be launching toward the end of this month, and it's going to be a good one. So, plenty of opportunity for a lot of different voices to get involved in this sort of exciting new era in space, and this, interesting new era with the change in leadership. So enough of the preamble. Let's just kind of get right to it. Lori, I wanted to start with you. This new administration is about to take over. Monday is inauguration day. There are a lot of expected changes, but there's also a lot of history to be gleaned here from President's first term. I'm talking about the Artemis program. I'm talking about Space Force. Help us set the table a little bit in terms of that history and where you think this next round is going to start to take us.
Sure. Well, again, thanks for having me, and it's great to join two friends, in Michelle and Courtney. It should be a great discussion. That alone tells you how we expect things to go. NASA, in particular, has not been partisan, and we have previous 4 years of experience with this exact president. That isn't typical. So hopefully should give people some comfort. That said, I think it's pretty clear the transition team's role is, as it always is, to come in and see how programs are doing that already exist, make sure they align with the longer term goals of the administration, because that really is the administration's role in a policy sense, to sort of shape the vision. Again, we've had the Trump team for 4 years, and so we have some breadcrumbs to follow. But things have changed also. And in the 4 years since they've been gone, how are the programs doing that they set up? Uh, Really, policy is people, and a lot of this is who do you appoint. And I will note that earlier than at any time, I believe, in the history, we have a NASA administrator nominee. And so we can read a lot into that. First, we ought to probably read that space is important to the administration. I know during my couple of times in, I cycled in under the Clinton administration, became a political appointee, so left in '01, was working to hand things over to Courtney and his team coming in back then in January of '01, and then coming in '08, '09 with Obama leading that transition team. We worked together well back in '01. I think the teams are working together well now. But I would have given my eye teeth to have the nominee appointed in December, early January, anytime
Right.
before the inauguration. So they should feel good about that. I think Jared's widely seen, viewed in the space community as a really positive, qualified person to do this. Um, but change is the only constant in life, and expecting change is something I know that is hard for people, but the truth is the role in a democracy is for a new administration to keep us on track and to make sure programs that are aligned with their vision and performing well continue. They should be given, I think, the ability to do that. And I expect there will be more change than usual because of the nature of this incoming president and because of their nominee, but those are probably things that will benefit the space program, and that's really what should be the rubric.
So let me sort of jump in there in terms of Jared Isaacman, who's just the presumptive nominee, or who is the nominee. Still has to be confirmed, obviously. This is a man who's been to space twice on private missions. But I want to go to you, Courtney, in terms of transitions, right? Because we've talked about this. You've been there. You've spearheaded some of these transition teams. But I also think this is kind of a unique time, not only in terms of exactly who's coming into the White House and the influence of those like Elon Musk, but also the nature of the control within Washington.
Mhm.
Because you have a Republican-controlled Congress, Republican-controlled White House. I would imagine, people think about this stuff in terms of the next 4 years. It might be that they're thinking about the next 2 years because you don't know what's going to happen with these midterms. Really, anything can happen in 2 years. So I guess, you know, first of all, is that fair? And second of all, is the clock then starting on Monday in terms of this race of the next 22 to 24 months?
Well, a couple of observations. One, as Lori was speaking, I was thinking back when I was on a panel with her. She was on the Obama transition team, and um, we were briefing a contractor who should go nameless. But I remember during the Q&A, she whispered to me, she said, "Boy, these people don't have a clue as to what's happening transition-wise." And of course, Constellation, right, Lori, was one of the programs that really terminated and rebuilt. I think to their credit. So in this instance, I would first start off that Trump 2.0 is coming in with the shock and awe that we're hearing about. And the question was always how much shock in ratio to the actual awe. Uh, but many of the people who are on the landing team are veterans from the first. So they've gone to school in the agency, lessons learned, they know where the bodies are. There's also a bizarre aspect to this that I should add. When Lori and I were managing our transition teams, we were formally engaged with the GSA, the president-elect team. We were part of press releases put out. This landing team has never been formally announced. It's only through the good reporting of Space News and other publications that we know who the names are. And it's not even clear to what extent they're formally even connected to the suggested changes going on down in Mar-a-Lago. And I often say, unless you were on close relationships with Elon and Vivek and Eric and Don Jr., and Susie Wiles and company in Mar-a-Lago, you're almost a car field being plugged up against the window pane looking in.
Yeah.
With that said, all the members of the landing team are familiar names to all of us on this call. All of them are extraordinarily bright people. And I have to believe are operating on philosophical assumptions and presuppositions that are aligned very much with the incoming team.
Well, I think that's the interesting question
Yeah,
mark, right? Because the
yeah,
philosophical shift that may be a part of this new administration, particularly with
yeah.
with the influence of Elon Musk and Michelle. This is like you and I have talked about this a bit. Um, space has many different components, right? There's the military, the civil, the industrial. All of these things are sort of wrapped together in what we sort of loosely define as space policy. But when we talk about Elon Musk, we talk about his influence across all of these. And it's not unprecedented for a company chieftain to have a huge impact on emerging industries. But I don't know how many times one of those chieftains has had an office on White House grounds, who sat atop a new agency that was tasked with making cuts across the board, and not to mention that this is the space sector. So this is sort of this rapidly sort of developing and emerging new commercial dynamic that's involved in this. So I was kind of wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the terrain that we're all now inhabiting.
No, I think, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be on with these people who have such knowledge of Washington. I'm the outsider looking in. I've not been to Mar-a-Lago, so I have no insight in that sense. But, David, you're absolutely right. It's not really unprecedented to see a lot of influence on an administration like this. It's really interesting to see, I think, because of social media, the way news spreads these days. We have a real personality. We have Elon Musk. And then when we partner that with Donald Trump and we think about sort of these visceral reactions people have, and I think, for example, when Space Force was announced, there was a lot of outcry, and Space Force is a force for good, literally. And so we hopefully can sort of now in 2.0 temper that visceral reaction and go and see what actually happens. I'm hearing through the grapevine so many things. We're not going to go to the moon. We're just going to go to Mars. This is going to happen. That's going to happen. We don't know. And I think, with Courtney and Lori, I think that's the message is, look, this is a smart team. Let's wait and see. Elon Musk, yes, he's going to have a lot of influence. I'm not going to say he's not. It's just, we see it. Robert Kennedy had a lot of influence on John Kennedy. You have individuals like this all the time. This just happens to be an individual doesn't really seem to care about public opinion. But I personally feel like, I would love to see a focus on space. And I would love to be able to say, oh, he's going to be right next to the president, and we're going to see space elevated in a way we've never seen before. But he and you mentioned Vivek, and they're focusing on other things as well. And so I think it's going to be really interesting to see how much time is spent sort of on Doge, and how much time Jared Isaacman is sort of on his own at NASA. But I think it's fascinating, but I do think from the historic standpoint, it's really not that unprecedented, except, of course, this is space and it will affect all of humanity, and not just railroads crossing the United States continent.
David, may I ask you
please,
something, if I may?
Yeah.
Because I wanted to answer about the 2 years. I think the 2 years is going to be equivalent to a tsunami. I think there's going to be a huge wave. I think many of the traditional contractors and lobbyists don't have a clue, right? So all their clients have probably asked for memos, trying to give us insight. They don't have a clue. I think everything is on the table. I think what you see in next 2 years, assuming, and I believe it's probable that Jared is in fact nominated and probably in place, let's say by February. I think everything from the SLS to the Artemis, you name it, are going to be on the.
Let's talk about that since you bring up SLS. I was going to talk about SLS a little bit later, but for those on the call, this is a special launch system. It was sort of meant to sort of further lunar exploration efforts as part of the Artemis program. That is a really interesting one, and that seems to be maybe some low-hanging fruit in terms of this. Not only in the sense that it's a competitor to Starship, but I mean, NASA officials themselves have said in that landmark government accountability report that SLS was not only behind schedule, but it was ultimately too expensive. And so, do you see any world in where SLS and Orion, and those still lingering questions about these heat shield and not to mention Gateway, all of these things that are kind of wrapped in this broader structure of a national push oriented around the moon, do they survive?
Is that directed to me or Laura?
Sure. No, we'll go to you, and then Laura, I'd love you to chime in.
Well, real fast. One, I would predict that there's not going to be any more increases in NASA's budget, right? So I'll put it out there. So I think you're going to have your trade space is very much going to have to be within that roughly $25 billion baseline, roughly. Secondly, I have got to underscore that there is one of the most radical directors of the Office of Management and Budget is going through his confirmation hearing today, Russell Vought. Russell was the director of OMB the last year of the last administration of the Trump administration. He has gone to school on everything from riffing, which is radical downsizing of the civil service, to the use of the Empowerment Act, which we can talk about as you wish later on. But basically, his interpretation is that gives the president unilateral right to stop funding, no matter what the Congress may appropriate. They have majorities. You have a president who is not shy about exercising authority. You have a president who, when advised by aides, oh, you're going to have to worry about the courts or a challenge in the court system or Congress, is probably not going to lose any sleep over that. And again, you've got a director of OMB looking to slash left and right. And he has spent years writing and studying how to slash. So if you're the NASA administrator, you're going in that context. And so you're going to have to look at everything that is a drain on the budget. And I'd also submit that they're going to resurrect Schedule F, which, for those of you who don't recall, would empower the president to take away protections of the civil service. And so you're going to see quite an extraordinary wave here in the coming months. With that, I'll turn it over to whoever you want to speak.
Yeah. I mean, just for context, in terms of those listening, the Empowerment Act gives the president a certain degree of leeway in terms of priorities. I think it's a span of maybe 45 days, but
It is,
how
but excuse me, but Russell Vought believes it's also unconstitutional.
right.
So he's got
And
a
how
very
that
radical
actually plays
view.
out in practice is sort of a different story. But
Correct.
Lori, I want to kind of go to you, not only in terms of the SLS question, but maybe the broader structure. But in doing so, I kind of want to go back to your book, because you've had a front row seat to this. You had a front row seat to Elon, obviously very early on. You were instrumental in a lot of this commercial push against sometimes some pretty serious headwinds. But in your book, you talk about a time when you were deputy administrator and you had a meeting with then Senator Nelson, who later became administrator. And I think you know where I'm going with this one here. But who essentially allegedly told you to get your boy Elon in line after he mentioned ways for SpaceX to potentially improve upon existing NASA programs. So, like, as we stand poised on the threshold of this new era, with Elon having such a larger role, it's almost a little bit ironic. But like, where does that take the agency? Where does that take us in terms of that new focus, in terms of cuts, in terms of restructuring, in terms of SLS? I mean, the list goes on and on.
Sure. Well, sticking with the human spaceflight theme, I'll first say we weren't really successful at canceling the Constellation program, which we honestly took a look at when we came in on transition team, found it so off track that it did not make sense, was not going to get us back to the moon, was not going to even allow us to keep the space station, etc. The changes we proposed were fought on the Hill. Senator Nelson, as I outlined in my book, along with Senators Shelby and Kay Bailey Hutchinson, were very, very strongly opposed. I am the first one to say this is a different environment now.
Yeah.
We too had both the House and the Senate majorities in Obama. We came in, we had 60 votes in the Senate. We were in Dreamline, but we did not have a NASA administrator who wanted to drive change and improvement. That is what we will have in Jared Isaacman. Can you imagine coming in? These are the two things I grapple with. Saying to the community, you know what, that whole Artemis thing, the moon thing, not interested, let's scrap it. Or saying to Elon Musk, I really don't think we can focus on Mars because we're focused on moon now. So hold that. we'll get to that maybe, in the future. I can't imagine either of those things. So my guess is we're going to try and do both. And, that flies in the face with a lot of the recent studies. I see we already have a question on the most recent Augustine review. NASA already has too much on its plate. So what will give? And this is to Courtney's point. Something has got to give. That's a combination of, in their minds, civil servants, centers, major programs that are not performing. So there's nowhere else to look without an expanding budget. And I happen to agree with Courtney. NASA won't be separated out and given more money when the rest of the agencies are asked to give back. But I'm not sure that leads to an immediate SLS shutdown, because if you are going to make a true effort at landing on the moon or Mars, I guess they've said they can do both within this period of time of one term president. Well, the only way to pay for that would be to not do some of the traditional SLS Orion Gateway things, but they may pick and choose between those. I don't have any particular insight. My point is, if we are really going to go somewhere, I'm lots of people are comfortable with counting on Starship once it is flying and operational. That is something that I think would make the difference for SLS. We're not quite there yet.
This is a great sort of pivot point in terms of the structure of the legal framework, I think, because Michelle, this is your domain in many ways, but it strikes me as that the nature of the commercial incentives to go to these other celestial bodies has to do specifically with the interlocking treaties that are there, specifically a treaty that was signed into law 2 years before we even went to the moon and landed in Apollo 11. I'm talking about the '67 Outer Space Treaty, but that treaty has been revised, or not revised, but reinterpreted, so to speak, and twice now, both under the Obama administration and in the Trump administration. And I'm wondering if you can, before we kind of talk about this pivot to Mars or the ability to do both, or I've even heard some people in NASA leadership say, Jeff, you do moon, Elon, you do Mars, and we'll kind of split the difference here. But the framework, the legal structure behind all this, I think, is really important in terms of commercialization. So provide us like a little bit of background here in terms of what we're talking about, so people can...
Absolutely. And so I do want to thank you, because I will notice when you talked about your new Space Minds podcast, you mentioned scientists and engineers. You didn't mention lawyers, and we're really important.
It was an oversight. It was an oversight.
So yeah, we have an outer space treaty, and as we all know, probably on this call, it says you cannot claim territory. But President Obama signed a law that says, well, we interpret that provision to mean we can extract resources. And then President Trump reinforced that, not only saying, yes, we agree and American citizens have the right to extract, but we also have this other weird moon agreement that a lot of people like, which sort of embraces space as a global commons in the legal sense of we have to share everything. And President Trump said we are absolutely not a part of the moon agreement. We never will be, and we do not consider space to be a global commons. As a lawyer, I say, I don't even know what a global commons is from a legal standpoint, so I approve that decision. But the fact is we are sort of leading the world in this concept. I mean, yesterday we launched Firefly, but also iSpace to the moon. And we're really looking at an effort realizing it's not just sovereigns out there. And so when we think, again, looking back at the Outer Space Treaty, Article 6 requires that the sovereign authorize and supervise. And this is going back to what Courtney was saying and Lori, we have 2 years. And the one thing that maybe we can do in these 2 years is actually create the mission authorization process that we need, that we've been dickering over for the past 6 to 8 years. Where do you go if you want to launch to the moon and get a license? I don't know, we have all sorts of provisions and all sorts of ideas, but we don't have a decision. So that's going to be a very important one. But looking, again, when we talk about the Artemis Accords and going back to the moon, we also have to remember that the Artemis Accords were developed in Trump 1. There's 52 signatories to that agreement right now. So 52 nations have come on board with the U.S. interpretation, with the allied U.S. and its allies interpretation of Article 2 saying you can extract. And on top of that, just last year, China issued a conference room paper to the United Nations that said, oh, yeah, we agree. You know, if you extract resources, you can use them. So this is the kind of
let me stop you right there because I want to ask you since you brought up China, I think this is a really interesting time to kind of pivot to that discussion just a bit because even though they agreed here, and even though we've had Firefly and iSpace who coincidentally just launched on a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket, the same rocket, there is this sort of increased competition, and I've heard questions about the primacy of getting there first. And this I don't want to say it's sort of the presence makes right, but there is like a question about norms that we're all kind of running up against here. And in a context of China, and not only China, I mean the Russians have made their own push towards the moon. India is certainly making their own push. But the Chang S7 mission is set for next year, and there's talk about planting a flag there. So I mean, just the visible act of planting a flag kind of like raises questions in terms of the norm setting that we're talking about, and we're talking about other celestial bodies, but at least in this case, in the moon.
David, it's a race, and I know a lot of people don't want to call it that because it feels like we're going back to the Cold War, but it's a race, and it's not just about prestige, and it's not just about planting a flag. It's about getting a lunar community, building a community, a base on the moon. What's really interesting about China, and as in their 2020 white paper, they didn't really talk about a human landing, and then all of a sudden they've now announced, oh, we're going to put humans on the moon by 2030. We're going to have a sustainable presence on the moon by 2030 or shortly thereafter. The Outer Space Treaty, that 1967 treaty, creates a first mover advantage. Article 9 has this concept of you have to have due regard for the activities of others. If you're there first and you can say, whoa, you should see the plume effect here. We're going to need you to stay 20 miles away from us. That's a norm that's created because you're there, and who can argue that you're wrong?
Yeah, and the interesting thing about part of that radius, that plume effect, where it's just sort of kicking up the regolith and the impacts of that is, Lori, maybe you can address this. The impacts or the value of real estate on the lunar surface is not that big. I mean, we're talking about regions, particularly in the lunar South Pole, where there's been overlapping landing sites, talking Shackleton Crater and otherwise. So, the presence of permanent sunlight and ability to kind of get in those permanently shaded regions where water ice seems to be trapped here. I mean, if this is a race, if this is a competition, and there is a sort of a primacy of being first, talk a little bit about that, like that, the importance of that specific real estate and how the structure of it all kind of falls into it.
I do think that is the discussion to have. Often it gets lost in the generalities of, oh, we're in a race. We won the race. We have been to the moon 6 times. This is strategically when you go next, both where do you go and how do you go? And I think that has been for a lot of us who believe in the longer term sustainable aspect of space exploration and development. The focus on the pole for Artemis made it really interesting. But with a vehicle that can only go every couple of years and at the cost that's clearly not sustainable, where you can only stay a little bit of time, is that going to be enough? I don't think the Chinese are going to beat us personally, whether we go the SLS or Starship route, because I just believe we have the depth and the ability to do this. And I think the political determination, again, I don't see this administration just completely bypassing this development of lunar activities, and the pole is exactly where someone like a Jared Isaacman
Yeah.
would want to be. And I think doing it in a sustainable way should still be the longer term goal, whether there's one or two more SLS flights or not. I
That's
think
the
most
question,
of
though,
us,
right? The question is whether it, not necessarily the question of whether you put boots on the ground in the polar region, but whether you have some sort of base camp there where you can do mining efforts and do, in situ resource development and the rest
and
of
to
it.
do that, you need to be repeatable and have it be within a cost range that you could do it, which was never the program that was established initially. So I think those are the pivot points we should expect to see.
Yeah.
And David, a reminder to the audience, we just elected a real estate guy, right? So hard to imagine that he's not going to want some American footprint on the moon, and it may well be a division of labor between Bezos, Blue, and Elon and SpaceX vis-a-vis Mars. Um, so I do think that we should take. Well, let me put it this way. Lori and I can tell you that when you manage transition teams, you take seriously the campaign rhetoric, right, Lori? That your president-elect has said in the campaign. This
Yep.
president's been very clear, both in the rhetoric and when he announced the Space Force in the first term, um, about domination. And I think he used the word America will dominate. Now, I defer to Professor Hanlon as to how you define that from a legal standpoint, but I believe you've just elected will have inaugurated a president on Monday who absolutely is going to want to ensure that that neighborhood up there in the South Pole has a very significant American presence. Second
Well,
point, yeah, go ahead.
no, to that point, I think, taking what folks say on the campaign trail at face value is a really sort of interesting talking point in that context. Because if you remember during the first campaign, he was talking about, why are we doing the moon? We've already done this. The interest is toward Mars. And, from folks that I've spoken with at NASA, they tell me that NASA sort of certain leadership was able to convince them otherwise, that, that the moon was this stepping stone to Mars. Now, in the context of, showing up on campaign trails with Elon Musk with an Occupy Mars t-shirt, and Musk also posting on X that the moon is a distraction, and that we're going straight to Mars. What does that mean? And can you do both?
Well, my second point was about Jared. Elon is an enormously profound influence, no question. But let's not be dismissive of Jared Isaacman. This fellow has built two major companies. I mean, this is an enormously brilliant individual. I've had just a few interactions with him, but he is a voracious reader. And like all coders, he's very systematic. Elon in his best, as Lori can tell you, is very, very systematic when he approaches problem solving. So Jared is not going to take a job. Like, he does not need this job, right? So he's taking it as a patriot, I'm convinced, and he's going to make his decisions. Now, obviously, the president's his boss and going to give him a certain set of mandates. But I think that Jared is going to sit down and look at what he's inherited in the inbox and give the president the best of his judgment call as to where the trades are and what is off the table, what isn't. But I would be astonished if we're sitting at the same four a year from now. And to Lori's point that he's taken the moon off the table, I think they're just some extraordinarily compelling points, with all due respect to our friend Bob Zubrin and the Mars Society, to not ignore the moon. And I just don't feel that our president has that mindset. Now, to what extent it's given priority vis-a-vis Mars and so forth, those are things that Jared will make judgment calls regarding, he and the team. And we also have to follow very carefully who that team is. Will they be political flunkies, or will they be people like Lori that brought an extensive background to that very important deputy job? And those individuals, to Lori's point about people making policy, are going to be critical to watch as well.
Michelle, I
David, can
want to talk to you a
oh,
little bit more about this sort of oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to say, I did want to point out just from a legal standpoint, also, what this transition from Trump to Biden, they didn't change space policy much. We kept going. And so, this might be the first time in history we actually have, a current thread. And we do have 52 signatories to the Artemis Accords. We cannot turn our backs on that. That's 52 allies who've been given, I don't know what they've been told they would be contributing, but it's a lot easier to form international collaboration around the moon where people can get to, where Mars technologically is going to be far more difficult for some of our partners in the Accords. And so I think we can't take the moon off the table.
Yeah,
And the Artemis Accord started under Trump. So
right.
Exactly.
Reminder.
Yeah. It's also harder to sort of unwind international agreements than it is necessarily policy. But Lori, I want to kind of ask you because we just talked about Firefly. We talked about iSpace. Intuitive Machines is going back to the moon at the end of February. And I've spent a lot of time speaking with that Intuitive Machines team. Cam Kafarian and Steve Altemus and Tim Crane, but also a number of the folks who kind of on the on the line, so to speak. And that Nova C lander was a methane oxygen powered vehicle. And that was intentional, right? There's, I think, especially for Mars, where methane can be harvested or created in abundance, they tell me that it's quite feasible to turn their moon landers into Mars landers. There's some aerodynamic aids that need to be shifted, and it's not the same vehicle, obviously, but it's not that big of a jump, especially when you're working with methane propulsion for like in situ resource development. So, is it your thinking like this is kind of where we were headed all along in terms of what the commercial space has been thinking about, in terms of the primacy of not just a lunar economy, but a Martian economy?
Sure. And to Michelle's point, this has continued through successive presidents and transitions, and I would argue well before Biden. I started in the Golden administration under Clinton. It continued in Courtney's time under Bush, etc. We took it back with Obama and continued this emphasis on commercial, on settlement, on efficiency and effectiveness. And where I think in the Biden administration, you can say they kept the stream of policy because, of course, it was working. They did emphasize, and most of the money went to the cost plus programs that have gotten us farther behind. So that's really the balance. How long do you keep those?
Before you go on, can you explain the cost plus for us for those who don't know on this call? Because this is one of the sea changes that we've seen in the last
Sure.
decade or so.
It's just how you acquire your programs can be done in the traditional way, which through the FARs, the real point to that is NASA is involved. They set the requirements. There are milestones that they establish and they change those requirements. And over time, I don't put all this on the companies for why these things, the cost increases and the time is delayed. It's not a system that is supposed to incentivize efficiency. Early on, I remember Orbital Sciences, David Thompson showed me two satellites in his high bay. This must have been in the 2008 timeframe. And he said this one was done for the Air Force with full cost plus accounting. It cost X. This one was done for the private sector. It costs Y with fixed cost, and the time and the cost were multiples different.
Yeah. With the idea of baking in a sort of a profit margin already on the front end, so to speak.
The incentives, and where you have a mature industry, especially, it makes sense. The lunar, clips, we've been pushing that. So these are fixed cost, and if they are able to do that, it's on the path everybody who's really been doing this, certainly my other panelists here have been on for decades, which is sure, the moon is a wonderful test bed for these exact kind of things. Does that mean we have to have two separate programs? And I have to take issue with this. Give the moon to Jeff let Mars go to Elon. That's not how we work in the government. Let's just all acknowledge where the public dollars are involved, there will be competition, there will be an ability for others to be involved, and the people that win typically, and I think especially in a fixed cost way, then have to perform to be paid. So these are not to be confused with big policy decisions about centers. I mean, I'm reading ahead, which is terrible. All these great questions you have in the feed. There's a lot this administration can do, and they're going to have a lot on their plate. One of the questions was even, why would Jared do it? Because he wants to make a difference. I hate to lose sight of the fact that NASA is a crown jewel. I know we're focused here early on NASA, and you want to discuss other space agencies, but really the NASA team, there's going to be change. I fully align with Courtney's remarks on that. But I think with the best interests, we should keep that in mind. I had the best interest. The Obama direction to me was basically to have NASA's best years not be behind them. That's a great thing. And let's give them a little bit of running room to do that.
So
Let me also add to that,
Oh.
David, if I may, that I
Please.
by no means am supporting dividing up artificially between Blue and SpaceX. So I absolutely applaud where Lori's coming down. Competition. Many of the large contractors, of course, abhor fixed price, but I think they better get with it, because that indeed is as painful as it is for their culture. They better get with it. So I think that's part of the continuing change. One other item, if I may, we focus on NASA. Notice what Trump did. He nominated the head of OSTP, Office of Science Technology Policy. In the first term, that took a long time to get that nominee, and a lot of the government employees, it was emasculated staff-wise. Now he's nominated Michael Kratsios, who is a technologist, very smart. His last job in the Trump administration, other than he was first chief technology officer, was to run the research engineering at the Pentagon. I briefed him. He is sharp as a tack. So I think you have someone coming in who, by the way, is very close to Peter Thiel in the case of Kratsios, who brings the type of technology sensibility that will align very nicely with where Jared is coming from. Just thought I'd put that out there.
no, that's great. We have about 5 more minutes before we're going to go into the audience questions, and there are a lot, so that they're coming in fast. So I want to make sure that we get to those. But in these last 5 minutes, I kind of wanted to take a little bit of a turn and focus on where this trajectory is going, maybe a little bit more long term. We talked about, sort of the interest and the personnel shifts, and maybe what's on the chopping block and maybe what's not. But I think it's for a man who once said that he wanted to die on Mars, though not on impact. It's an interesting conversation to have about Mars. And I remember seeing, this was a number of years ago, I think it was back in 2020, like buried in the beta software agreement of the SpaceX Starlink app. And Michelle, I want to go to you with this. I have a sense that you know where I'm going with this, but I'm going to quote the line. It said, "For services provided on Mars," now granted there's no Starlink on Mars at the moment, "or in transit to Mars via Starship or other colonization spacecraft, the parties recognize Mars as a free planet and that no Earth-based government has authority or sovereignty over Martian activities. Accordingly, disputes will be settled through self-governing principles established in good faith at the time of the Martian settlement." Now, Elon has a reputation for making some jokes about this stuff and poking the bear a little bit. But I remember later on there was an interview that SpaceX General Counsel David Anderman gave to a Law 360 that said essentially that SpaceX would move to impose its own legal regime at the time. Was even talk about developing sort of a constitution for some of these new colonies that were coming up. And so it reminded me, this is a long question, but I'm going to you, Michelle. It reminded me of the precedent back in the 1600s when you had the Virginia company that was colonizing Jamestown, and early colonists were effectively employees, and sort of the rough and tumble nature of frontier towns. And, I guess thinking about these things in the context of those early human settlements, if they do come to pass, um, what are we in for in terms of governance, in terms of structure, in terms of how we deal with these things, in terms of the charters maybe that will apply from back on Earth, and the way the Outer Space Treaty already deals with these things?
Yeah, I mean, David, we have no idea. And that's what is so exciting, right? Because, when that contract came out, everyone said, "Oh, he can't do that." Well, guess what? He did. He put it in the contract. Now, is it going to look like on Mars? Don't forget that you're not, when he arrives on Mars, there isn't a potato farm there already growing, right? There's no water there. He is going to be any community is going to be tethered to Earth for quite some time. And so there will still be opportunities to sort of gently frame what that community is going to look like. But I don't know what it's like to live on Mars. You don't. Nobody does. So how can I, even as a lawyer, even as a busybody, even as a, control freak, how can I pretend to suggest what laws should exist on Mars? It has to be from the bottom up, rooted, and all we can do, and I think Lori and Courtney would agree with this. Our job is really is like those future communities are like children to us, right? We can build them and build them and build them and give them all the support they need and instill them with all the right ideas and on the right hopes. But then, poof, they go to college and they're on their own. So they get to Mars and we hope that we've done a good job of instilling the, human rights, and all sorts of, constitution things that we take for granted in our constitution that you might not get if you are flying from China, for example. And so this is something we really need to think about. And again, I bring the focus back to the law, because that's one thing we really want to focus on is there are going to be humans in space, and we want to make sure they're protected because we want to be able to move off of our planet. Not all of us want to, but some of us do. And we want to have a thriving spacefaring future.
Laura, do you
David,
want to chime in on that? Or Courtney?
sorry, I know you want to get the Q&A. I just thinking that another theme that their audience should be sensitive to in the next 2 years: speed, speed, speed. There is no patience with this incoming crowd, none, for simply saying, well, that's the nature of government. We're slow. If you have that attitude, leave, because you're about to have a painful experience. And I include 3- and 4-star generals in the Pentagon, as well as senior people in NASA. The other point I want to make, and we didn't mention it during what might be on the table, lunar gateway. Now, I'm about to get some hate mail from my friends at NASA and among the contractors. I've never been a fan. I think it was a case where the great Jim Bridenstine got somewhat sucker punched into it. As Lori knows, the project managers run the agency, and you've got to really understand that culture, what drives those individuals. And I think one of the many reasons he was unable to make the President Trump's first term objective of getting to the moon quickly was a gateway. It's a jobs program, and there are lots of other different ways to go about servicing that mission. So Jared's coming in with, I think, a wide open looking at all these various things he's inherited in terms of making trades. So with that, I'll go back on mute.
Gateway being, just to clarify for those in attendance, gateway being sort of that miniature orbiting lunar station that would support lunar efforts. And there has been some criticism with that, especially in the competition with the lunar reacher station that the Chinese and Russians are developing. I want to go to Q&A right now from the remaining 14 minutes of this call. This goes quick, doesn't it? We covered a lot of topics, but we'll see if we can get through as many of these questions as possible. The first one is from Leonard David, and it says the recent Academy study led by Norm Augustine calls NASA at a crossroads. Lots of problems, too much on their plates, and infrastructure woes. Why would anybody take on NASA given the myriad of issues identified by the Augustine Group? Lori, I remember you mentioned during the call, like reading
Yeah,
into that.
I read that. I read the report and didn't find much to disagree with. And one of my reactions to Jared Isaacman agreeing to be NASA administrator is good for him. He's a patriot. He's doing this because he believes, as I said earlier, not only in the real um, the special nature of what we do at NASA, but in the country, and this is public service for sure. What better way to acknowledge that he's a billionaire? He doesn't need a job. He'll be giving up quite a bit. Uh, why do you do it? You do it because NASA truly is a crown jewel, and we aren't doing what we should do on behalf of the American people. I mean, I think that's frustrating to all of us, even if you're somebody who thinks I'm the one who ruined it. But the truth of Jared agreeing has something to do, I think, with him being willing to take on these hard things. He is a smart person, and there are a lot of hard things on NASA's plate. Probably harder than my other two tours. There's a lot of to be done. And of course, the speed that Courtney spoke of doesn't lend itself to analysis. So that I know can be difficult for people. So really back to this point of, the community, getting people briefed up where there are opportunities, help. There are things that I think we're seeing comments wise. Is Congress going to do? Well, all that makes a difference in the community. We proposed some of these things that I think almost everybody now, including Senator Nelson, who wanted to stop it, now agree they were the right things to do. But the knee-jerk reaction is, no, change is bad. It's upsetting. If we weren't for change, we wouldn't be going in space. Pioneers are really those who are going to be successful. These things we're trying to do are audacious, and I'm certain have all kinds of issues with any cuts they might make to earth sciences. We will let you get to the questions there on those things, but some of what they're doing, I'll be supportive of, I'm sure.
Yeah. David, very quickly, 30 seconds. And I'd say that at the risk of Steve Bannon, who could care less what I have to say, but we come knocking on my door here. I'm not a deep state conspiracist. There's some extraordinary civil servants at NASA, brilliant. And if you want to look for reform and some radical change, it's not as far away from the office of the administrator in some cases as you might expect. So my hope is that when Jared, and my expectation is that when he looks at these various trades and what potentially could be cut and so forth, that he is consulting some of those folks.
Well, let's go to that right now, because this actually leads really well into Brent Sherwood's question, and his question is essentially this: how irreversible are the contract commitments NASA has made for SLS, Orion, and Gateway, and sort of what maneuvering room in practical terms can the administration actually have?
I'll just jump in. A lot of those contracts were extended under my watch. We went through a very challenging time because the previous administration had not put in termination liability provisions in those contracts. So we had to clean that up. Those provisions are there, which now means their funds are being withheld for termination. That is something that all major cost plus programs do. And so that is particularly done so that people can't say, oh, this is so far along, it'll cost more to cancel it than keep going. That's different than the sunk cost argument, but they can be canceled. And another question asked about Congress's likelihood of doing it. Not too likely. But I'm the person who failed to get a program like that canceled. It was much smaller, Ares 1, but it was off track. And again, my point being that you had a NASA administrator at that time who really wasn't on board with a new plan, and the NASA administrator coming in, this will be his plan. You still have people in their districts already posturing to do this, but if you can put forward, and we're a very different position with the commercial heavy lift potential even yet today, this week, we're closer to having solutions other than a government operated and owned heavy lift vehicle. Again, we're not right there, so there might be some overlap. Jared and his team may decide we need to fly it one or two more times, but really the question, can you afford that, and is the right thing to do if Starship is starting to fly 100 times a year? Questions. It's not human rated. Are you kidding me? You'd rather fly on something that's flown once versus 100 times because there's a human rating? I don't think so. Uh,
The-
so, so
Lori,
challenges to canceling these, and I'm not predicting a wide swath of cancellations first thing, but I don't think there's going to be room for or time for a study. And I think it's a question of how much can they do within the budget and still accomplish real progress.
Laura, you mentioned something earlier. I kind of want to do a little bit of addendum, then I'll get to the remaining questions. But you mentioned almost like a concern with the earth sciences, and I wonder, just more broadly speaking, in terms of the conversation about speed, but also about priorities, as we see sort of a growing commercialization and a leaning in towards the commercial development. Is there a danger of the kinds of projects and science experiments that don't have immediate return on investments? We're outside sort of like the low-hanging fruit of like developing pharmaceuticals in Geo and Leo, uh, and that as we start to look toward this International Space Station that nears its retirement and growing influence of commercial space stations, be it Orbital, Reap, or others, um, is there something lost in the process in sort of the rush towards a commercial push?
I
I'd
don't
like
think
to
so.
answer that too,
No,
but go ahead, please.
I'm a space pirate, got all the credentials, but my goals are different than personally going. My goals in the policies over the last 40 years that I've had an opportunity to impact include the sustainable, effective, efficient, so more, not only people, but things that are important that we do in space can be done. Lowering the cost of space transportation was critical, not just for human spaceflight, but for
Mm.
all the science that we do. Most of what we know about our changing climate is from satellites, Earth science. When you lower the cost, you can fly more advanced sensors. You've now got more capability. Starship's going to offer incredible opportunities for scientific missions. You could run
Sure.
through decadal missions actually in a decade compared
Yeah.
to the 50 years it would take now. These are benefits that I think are really the underpinning of why we needed to do what we just,
Yeah.
I'm not going to even say we started it because it's
Yeah.
been ongoing for decades.
Yeah.
This, like every other part of our economy, works when there's a customer beyond just the government. And
Sure.
what we do in space has a lot of customers beyond NASA.
Yeah. Let me just
In,
add
in
an
terms of
addendum.
one second, Corey,
Yeah.
we can get to this. I want to make sure I get through some of these remaining questions here, but
Okay.
we'll hold that your answer to the back end of this one. I'll go to you on this question.
All right, sir.
It's a Europe question. It's a sort of a Europe and Artemis question. So this is from an anonymous attendee, but how do the panelists see cooperation with Europe moving forward under the new administration? And this individual notes that ESA is sort of effectively embedded within SLS by providing the service module and gateway, as well as the Mars sample return architecture. So, in terms of administration, that is often known for sort of going it alone in certain things, and not necessarily, at least in terms of what we've seen with some of these climate accords, it doesn't always value international frameworks and agreements, even though they forged this one. Where does this sort of go between with Europe sort of stand now?
You want me or you want Michelle to?
Sure, Courtney, yes, please.
Yeah, I just want to make a very quick plug for Jared. He is extraordinarily focused on science. We had him as a speaker at Beyond Earth symposium. So it'd be interesting to see where he comes down. But I think you've got to go in with the presumption that Jared's going to be extraordinarily supportive of the science-oriented programs. In terms of Europe, it's interesting. I don't. There are ways that the agency, I think, and Jared and his team are going to look to lever the euros and the Japanese yuan, for example. And so I don't see them summarily going in with a weed whacker or a howitzer, depending on your metaphor. I think they're going to take quite seriously these long-term commitments. But I do not believe the going in proposition is that they're going to let it or those titular agreements be the impediment. So there's going to be some very heavy duty engagement and dialogue, I think, going on within the first year, let alone 2 years. And I think you're going to see, this is me speculating, some renegotiation involving, for example, the Gateway Lunar and space station. You know, you got some lobbyists trying to push, you know, the current termination date's 2030. There's some have vested interest in trying to push it out beyond 2030. You've got some of your commercial habitats, obviously, would like the baton passed on sooner than later. So we'll see. That's an interesting dynamic that he's among many that he's inherited.
Right. All right. So the next question, we got about 3 minutes left. So this may or may not be the last one, depending on like how succinct we are. But this is from Adrian Haskamp. Wants to know, like, can we spend some time discussing the Trump administration's likely impact in terms of telecoms and satellites, both commercial and government? Because we haven't dug into this too much here. For anyone who wants to take this in terms of where this trajectory might be headed.
So I think that one of the things we really need to look at, especially with respect to satellites, and I note there was an article this morning that Chinese scientists had figured out how to target and hit Starlink satellites, and that's part of their national strategic plan. But, you know, we are starting to see more arguments or dissonance in the ITU because China wants to have 80,000 constellations. And you know, Elon Musk wants to have 40,000. You know, these are questions that I don't think are coming to a fore because it's Trump coming in. These are questions that have been percolating for a long time. You know, we want to use our orbit to the best capability that we can, and are we? You know, right now we have a program where we are holding orbits sort of aside for developing countries who have and is that really the best use of our orbit? Are we really harnessing our opportunities properly? But these are questions that are going to come to a head. We've seen, you know, Iran complain about Starlink also through the ITU and the COPUOS. But this I think is a measurement of how much access to space has increased, and how much more we're understanding that we can use space to help the human experience on Earth.
Lori, I'm going to give you the last word on this one with the minute that we have remaining.
Well, I will say there's a whole bunch of things in this the questions I would love to just go in and respond to. But on regulatory side, on satellite side, we know those are going to be things that are changed by this administration. But then you're also seeing these really anti Elon comments. He's not even a citizen. How can he's a citizen? Let's clarify that question. And again, there are always things that people disagree with that an administration advances for space. I will have many. I could tell you what they are. And the issue really is getting people who do align with a vision in the administration and having them go about doing their job in a way that makes progress. You're really judged, I think, not while you're in, but while you're maybe 10 years out. I'm having, you know, a really wonderful time seeing things like the transporter missions where I had to fight to let NASA be willing to do hosted payloads. Think of the things that people didn't want to do that we are doing now that have changed and advanced in a positive way the industry.
Yeah.
Certainly, there's going to be the opposite taking place, but I think we're all helped by an analysis rather than just across the board dismissing of progress, even though it'll be hard for different sectors along the way.
Yeah,
You
and
know,
David, I know that was the last, but very quickly, Brendan Carr coming in as the FCC chair is very close to Elon, and to close the loop on my earlier comment about Russell Vought taking over OMB, he's been very explicit about the need to circumscribe the FCC, which is an independent regulatory agency. So that's a set of teasers for those of you who want to, see what the lines, how the dots get connected in the coming couple of years.
We might have to do another one of these, or maybe we could just extend this webinar by another 6 or
Would
7
love it.
hours. No, but in all candor, thank you all for making time for us. Lori Garver, Michelle Hanlon, and Courtney's dad, and for everybody in attendance. This has been just a really enlightening web forum. There's big times ahead, and we haven't even discussed the sort of the confluence of technologies with quantum and AI and how all this is sort of reshaping the landscape. That's another one that's coming up. But before I go, I just want to give us another plug for our new podcast that's coming out end of this month, Space Minds. It promises to have more of these types of conversations. So as we go forward and as we kind of see how the landscape shakes out, we'll be having lawyers, Michelle, but also scientists and policymakers and entrepreneurs and engineers and physicists and a partridge in a pear tree. So anyway, I appreciate all of you taking time, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Welcome. Thanks.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.